You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Today is November 24th, 2020, and I'm here with my good friend and fellow classmate at George Mason University, David Prychitko. Dave, thanks for coming on with me.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Pete.
I'm really looking forward to taking a little bit of a trip down memory lane, but then focusing on where all this stuff leads us to, because many of the same tensions and turbulations that we faced when we started our careers of looking at the collapsing of a system and trying to understand that, maybe hitting a little too close to home now. Sure. and hitting here, but it's the same kind of thing. So before we get there, you attended Northern Michigan because you had a passion for the outdoors and the environment. And how did you find your way to economics?
Yeah, it's I was from the Chicago area, and my friends, when I was graduating high school, the ones who went to college, they're all going into engineering and like heading off to University of Illinois and places like that. And I've always had a special spot for the North Country, the upper Midwest. And so that sense of place has always been important to me. And the reason why I picked Northern Michigan University is because I wanted to go into chemistry. And they had a double major, chemistry and water science.
Yeah. Okay.
And there's no other program that I looked into that had something like that. And it combined, laboratory and outdoors. And I thought, this is great. So I come up to the Upper Peninsula and have my first semester here, fall of 1980. And I take Economics 101 at 8 o'clock in the morning. And it changed everything. The professor, Neil Carlson, other professors in the department were using the Hayne textbook, The Economic Way of Thinking. But this professor used Heilbronner and Thoreau, The Making of Economic Society, which had like an economic history component to it. But we also learned supply and demand, opportunity cost, and all that. And by the end of that fall semester, I dropped my double major. I announced I'm majoring in economics, and I never looked back from that point. I took micro principles the next semester, and the textbook was Alshin and Allen's Exchange and Production. Yeah. And I took that with Phil May, who was a student, a UCLA student of Alshin. And so here I'm learning about property rights and incentives and this type of thing. And I thought that's just how economists thought. I thought that's how, it's 1980, but I thought that's how, I'm learning this, that's how economists think. And the following semester I had macro principles, and the professor, Tom Holmstrom, used Gwartney and Stroop. So I'm learning public choice, and I'm thinking, I wasn't even thinking about it. This is just the way economists think.
Yeah.
And then for intermediate micro, I was back with Phil May, and he used Hirschleifer's textbook. So I got a really good training, I think, in microeconomics, certainly, and the whole property rights type of, basic institutions type of analysis, combined with public choice, and I was thrilled with it. And I also had a course by Howard Swain, who was another Alshin student. And it was called Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. I had that in my junior year. And the main book was Schumpeter's book by the same title. Mm-hmm. And it was in that course, I wrote a paper for it. The only paper I wrote as an undergraduate. And instead of taking the final exam, he said you could write a paper. And so I did that. And I asked him, what should I write about? What are topics to explore? And he said, you know what? No one's done a comparison of of Schumpeter's market socialism to Longa's, Oscar Longa's. He said, why don't you look into that? And I did, and I thought that this is fascinating. And it was through that paper and that exploration that I discovered Don Lavoie in the Journal of Libertarian Studies back in the old days when Rothbard had.
Because he published that, what, 81 or 80 something?
Yeah. On Don's article on the socialist calculation debate. And I had discovered Mises before that. I came across his economic policy book at a bookstore in the Loop in Chicago. And that was my first exposure to Austrians, that simple little book. But I really got into it with Lavoie's piece in the JLS. And that's when I started looking into, and this is before the internet and all of that. Right. So it was hard to look into graduate programs. Where do you get the information from? And I'm not sure where I got the information about George Mason's program in the center. It might have been in an ad in the JLS or something. I'm not sure. But I knew this is someone who I really want to study under. My professors were grooming me for UCLA. Yeah, right. And that's where I originally had planned and hoped to go. But when I discovered George Mason and the early Center for the Study of Market Processes, and they brought Buchanan and Tulloch with the Public Choice Center, I thought this, and it's a brand new PhD program there. My professors were a little bit hesitant.
Sure.
I was all gung-ho for George Mason. And when I got to Mason, I never looked back either. I should say more things about my undergraduate education. In Psych 101, I was exposed to Thomas Kuhn and paradigms because the professor taught psych as a series of competing paradigms, Freudianism, behaviorism, humanistic psych, and all that. I was exposed to Habermas in a social and political philosophy course. So I had this great background, a nice background that complemented, in some ways, complemented my economics. And I ended up going off to George Mason. But I didn't really know what I was doing, Pete. I was a first-year college student. I really didn't know what graduate school was. I had applied and gotten accepted. Think how foolish this might sound. I applied and got accepted into Chicago, UCLA, Florida State, Clemson, Illinois, and I can't recall my status at NYU nor at Auburn. I applied to both of them, but I can't remember what the final result was. But here's the thing. I'm getting letters from these places saying I've been accepted and we have money for you or an assistantship. Chicago didn't offer me a penny. I was just thrilled to get in. Yeah. But the other schools had assistantships for me. And I'm waiting to hear from George Mason. I got an acceptance letter from them, but I'm waiting to hear if they're going to give me a tuition break or an assistantship or anything like that. And I talked to Don. By the way, I never visited any of these schools. I never did campus visits. I didn't even know about that possibility. So I'm talking to Don on the phone, and he's excited about me and all of that. And I said, I need to know because I got these other programs that I applied to, and they have deadlines. And Don's kind of hemming and hawing and apologizing. And here's the foolish thing, in a way. I turned down every one of those schools, though, because their deadlines came up.
Right. I
turned down every single one of them, waiting to get that final phone call from Don saying, we have an assistantship for you, which I did. It was during spring break up here, and I was so thrilled to receive that message from him.
It's funny, first of all, I mean, it speaks tremendously to the education that you received at Northern, that you can remember to this day, your psychology class and how it introduced you, and a social and political thought class. I have a similar kind of experience with my undergraduate at Grove City. And I always wonder whether or not, kids going through school have the same kind of series of things that their professors were so impactful on them or whatever. So it wasn't Kuhn, but it was Michael Polanyi. I had a teacher in my first year, Reed Davis. He teaches at the university in Seattle now, and I owe him tremendously because we had to read the standard stuff in the first semester, and then the second semester we started out by being exposed to things like Polanyi's Science, Faith, and Society. He was a man of deep religion, Reed Davis, but he was also a person of science, and so it was this interaction between faith and science that was a big part of his study. And I had that in the criticism of scientism that comes from Polanyi. I heard that before I heard that, and because Polanyi has another book which you made us read too called The Study of Man. And so I had to read those two things before I was even reading Hayek or whatever these things. And so when I started reading Hayek, it sort of made complete sense because Reed had already alerted me to these other things. And anyway, I just have a bunch of different professors that had this huge impact on me in this regard, and I'm pretty sure none of my other classmates had the same reaction. And I can remember it like it was yesterday, the things that they taught me and what they were stressing.
Yeah, and it's a shame that other students, and I try to impress this upon my own, they have to take gen ed courses and that type of thing. And I've always told them, take these courses seriously. Take an anthropology, a cultural anthropology course, or take a sociology 101 course. Yeah. And I tell them, and I'm not, making this up, but I remember a lot of things that I've learned, and I've took those two courses and of course others. And a lot of that has stuck with me. And I think it's also important that students get some sense of perhaps contrast.
Yeah.
Economics, right?
Yeah.
And find potential weaknesses in their own field of study, or possible even greater strengths in their own field of study, economics, being exposed to these other disciplines. So it doesn't surprise me at all. I remember you talking about Polanyi very early on, and having read him as an undergraduate. And books, The Study of Man and the lesser-known Science, Faith, and Society, nice thin books that have a real solid message. And I would suggest students read those two first and then tackle
personal knowledge.
Yeah.
So what's fascinating to me, and this is maybe a little insider baseball, but people should look up these references, is that, in your talk about your undergraduate education, and you wrote a paper on Schumpeter and socialism later on. You wrote your very first paper, I think, is a review essay of Polkinghorne's stuff on methodology of the social sciences.
Oh boy, right? you remember that? Or you've done your homework?
No, I remember that because remember I was the editor of the journal at the time. But then you also wrote a paper on the potlatch system.
Yeah, which went nowhere.
Yeah, I understand that, but you wrote it, and early on, I mean, maybe first year graduate school, you were already taking these things, so and merging them with economics. It was, in each one of these cases. So, and the one last thing is I want to share with you is my impression. I decided to go to George Mason because of Don as well, and it was because of that Journal of Libertarian Studies piece. And it's interesting because Hayek eventually had the same reaction on me that Don did. But I actually read Don in more detail than I read Hayek at the time when I was an undergraduate. Because when I first read The Road to Serfdom, I wasn't too impressed by it because I was Rothbardian, But the reality is that I had a great undergraduate teacher who was a polemicist, not a scholar. He, flew and gave chicken dinner talks, and he was powerful. He was a great speaker. He could rile up a room, especially if you listen to him. And then he exposed us to Milton Friedman, but not Milton Friedman the way you were exposed to Milton Friedman, which I want to come back to in a second. But he exposed us to Free to Choose, Capitalism and Freedom, Milton Friedman, and the Newsweek columns, so Friedman again. And then you read Mises, and Mises, is this powerful thinker, but he's not in a constant dialogue with other scholars, right? So it's just like this powerful magnum opus that he's like throwing at you. Sure. And so it's like trying to drink out of a fire hose when you're 18, 19 years old or whatever. So then I come along Lavoie, and it was the first time I read economics. This is maybe my own fault, but the first time I read economics in where the professors in my other disciplines, philosophy, because I was a joint major, philosophy and economics, but also I took law classes and the pre-law class because I thought I was maybe going to go do that. And I had a great teacher in that. Lavoie was the first one that was a scholar. Constant dialogue with other people that he was arguing against, including Marx and everyone else. And so I was completely blown away. I was like, oh my God, I want to be like him. Like, I want to be a scholar like him. I don't want to be Senholz and pugnacious, right? I mean, obviously I'd like to be Milton Friedman because that's better than John Kenneth Galbraith. And so if I could be Milton Friedman beating John Kenneth Galbraith, that's better, right? Sure. But I kind of knew that Friedman was specially gifted. So, and Galbraith was specially gifted. Sure. And so unless you're Friedman and you try to tackle Galbraith, you're in trouble because, he has a better command of the way to use words. And so what was available was this Lavoie kind of approach of like, I'm going to really do a deep dive and weigh all the arguments and do all of that. And I kind of became convinced about that to such an extent that I had a similar experience as you. I went to George Mason and basically my tuition waiver became a fellowship after I was there.
Oh, yeah.
Because like Rich Fink thought like, man, this poor kid's going to starve to death.
Right.
But I went there because I wanted to study with Lavoie. I mean, because that was like at the master's feet. And again, how weird it was is my choices at the end of the day were between going to the Center for Libertarian Studies because Murray Rothbard was offering a series of lectures. Right. Or go to graduate school. Right.
You made the right choice, Pete.
I go to graduate school rather than this. And I told this story the other day. I'm not sure if I told you this. This might be the first time it's on print. But, I was weighing options, and Rosemary and I went up to New York. And her the woman who was her maid of honor in our wedding was a graduate student in New York living in the East Village. So we stayed in the East Village. And I went around, saw what NYU was like and everything like that. And then I went to the New School because one of the things I hope that I might do is maybe I'll go to the New School and I'll be like Lavoie and I'll be able to study Marxism and I'll know it so well that I'll be able to challenge it or whatever. That was my thinking at the time. I mean, and that's not every graduate student that goes to economics thinks like that, but that's how I thought. And I went over to a lecture by Anwar Sheikh, who does tries to fix Bumbavrik's, transformation problem. And this is in 1982 or 83, something like that, right? And we're sitting there, I guess 83. And I'm sitting there, I'm listening to the lecture, and about 5 minutes into the lectures, my eyes glaze over, and I'm like, WTF is this guy talking about? Right. He's not going to be able to solve this. So I decided I can't put up with that for 4 years. Well, about 2 years ago, I was at a conference and he was the keynote speaker and he was going to talk about the transformation problem. And I turned to the person next to me. I go, 35 years ago, I sat and listened to this lecture and I decided not to go study with him. And I said, now I want to see if he started talking.
Right, did he solve the problem?
Yeah. He started about 5 minutes into his talk. I leaned over to the guy and said, I made the right decision.
Yeah.
Which is probably my own fault again for not understanding it. But it was interesting because I don't think you and I were that unique. I think that George Mason had a kind of weird vibe at that time in the beginning of its program that people went there. I mean, Jerry also got into Chicago, I think. Steve got into Yale.
Steve got into Yale.
Yeah, Steve, I think, got into Yale. but maybe no money, right? But he got into
sure.
Jerry got into Chicago, but they didn't give any money. I don't think they gave money to the first year students back then. If we remember correctly, is that you had to get through their exams, right? Their defaults on certain exams. But when earlier on, before I started suicide, this is the last I'll tell about myself, but earlier on, I remember this thing about what economics is because, again, when you're an undergraduate, you only know the economics you're being taught. You don't really know, and you know that maybe people don't agree with it, but you don't have a sense of the disagreement, right? So I was teaching tennis, and someone that I knew that was involved with tennis was involved with Rutgers. And they said, you should just keep teaching tennis and go to graduate school at night. They have the classes at night. You can do economics. So they set up me to be able to talk to someone at Rutgers about their graduate program. And the person asked me, what would you like to work on? And I can remember I said, the metaphysics of liberty. and this economics professor just looked at me. like that was the conversation. It didn't go anywhere. And I can remember walking out and saying, boy, why doesn't that guy understand what economics is about?
Yeah.
And I'm sure he walked out and said, what is wrong with this kid?
Sure.
And so it was fascinating. But in Lavoie, we both found this kind of thing. We both had a similar experience. The idea of getting him to tell us to come there was a very exciting aspect of the whole process. But I want to go back because your teachers were all UCLA Chicago guys. Yeah. And I didn't know that you had Alchin and Allen before you had Hain. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that. That's fascinating.
Yeah, in fact, so like I said, the 101 was Heilbronner and Thoreau, the textbook. And I didn't have the Hain textbook in any of my undergraduate courses. But I became a tutor my junior and senior year, and I was tutoring economics and 101 students who did have professors using the Hain book. Right. Yeah. That's when I decided I should read this textbook too, to get a sense of how these courses are being taught and what these students are finding, the emphasis that they're finding, so I could tutor them better. So I basically came across Hain as a tutor. Yeah. And like I said, I was raised in this UCLA property rights Allen type tradition. You had mentioned Milton Friedman. And
you also were trained in monetarism.
Well, yes.
About Milton Friedman's monetary framework before you went to graduate school.
Yeah. We had in our principles courses once a week, the Free to Choose videos, which I really enjoyed.
Yeah.
And I read the Free to Choose book. And, I was a little confused because here Reagan rises to power and there's talk about free market, this and that. And maybe for a couple weeks, I thought, Reagan did have something to do with free markets. Yeah. But yeah, I did read on my own the Robert Gordon's edited book, Milton Friedman's Monetary Framework. Yeah. And that's where I really understood. I of course, I was exposed to monetarism in my intermediate macro course. But going into that book and those essays and debates, it's a series of debates. Paul David sits in there, right, and others. And I kind of surprised myself because I felt I could understand the book. I could understand the debates as an undergraduate, not being guided through that particular analysis. And that had an effect on me.
How valuable do you think being a tutor was?
Very valuable.
Yeah.
Because I think it set the stage for my teaching career, because here I had to articulate. Students would have questions. Most of it was basic questions, not quite understanding opportunity cost or whatever it might be, economic profit versus accounting profit. And I found on the spot, without notes of my own, I had to try to clearly articulate to students. First, I had to understand what their question was, and then be able to provide some type of answer to that. And I think tutoring as an undergraduate had a big impact on my long run, formation as a teacher itself. I was really glad to have that opportunity. I worked in the slop line in the school cafeteria my first year or two, and it felt really good to be in that setting that engaged in thoughts with other students. And I knew by the end of my sophomore year that I wanted to go to graduate school, even before I became a tutor.
Yeah.
And I did. And the reason why I wanted to go to grad school was simply because I enjoyed economics so much. I wanted to study it as long and as far as I could.
Yeah.
I didn't have any pretense of I'm going to become a professor or this or that. I just wanted to study the discipline.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until probably my senior year that I thought, no, what am I going to do with the PhD? I'll become a professor.
Yeah.
So there's that. Rothbard. I had, like I said, I discovered Mises almost accidentally on a bookshelf.
So can I ask you a question real quick about the monetarism stuff, though?
Yeah, sure.
So since you were learning the monetary framework, by the way, I forgot that you told me that you worked in the cafeteria. I went to college to play sports, and my first college I went to play sports at, I was getting money to be there. Not a lot, but enough that it was kind of it was important that I keep doing it. But I had jobs, quote unquote jobs. And they were given by the athletic department, but it depended a lot on your performance. So in the beginning, my job was a very cushy job. And then, I did some things, I got hurt and I wasn't doing stuff. The coach was kind of pissed off at me. And I show up at the cafeteria and I used to just be able to alert someone in the back when the milk was going out. That originally was my first job, is I would sit there and as I'd see students doing it, I'd say, hey, the milk needs to be changed. I didn't change the milk. I told someone else to do it.
Right.
They told me I've been reassigned. I'm in a cast and I get reassigned. They make me in the dish room. And I had pretty good hand-eye coordination at that time, and I could do things. So they actually made me be the dish loader because I had to, grab like 5 dishes and like load them like this. And then when I got a little better, I got taken off the line and doing some other job. Then I didn't do as well, and they put me back on the line. And so when I got to Grove City and transferred, I wanted some extra cash. And they said, like, well, what can you do? And this is before I was playing any sports again at Grove City. And so I was like, well, I have experience as a dishwasher. And so my first semester at Grove City, I also worked loading dishes again, to get extra money. And
you didn't tutor, Pete?
I never tutored until I was in graduate school, but it changes your life when you have to teach. And that's I want to talk to you. I mean, we never would have expected that we would have been involved with the Hain book. So maybe we should talk a little bit about that later. But we both used the Hain book as a touchstone for teaching that very first introduction for 20 years before we ever were involved with it at all. But I want to ask you about the monetarism thing because, again, you had very good teachers, right? And your classmates, you should point out, I mean, your classmates went on to graduate school and did well themselves and stuff. And so it wasn't, like, you were the only one going to graduate school. There was a core of people around there before you and after you. And so how did the Austrian stuff hit you when you first read about, like, say, Austrian business cycle theory?
Right.
And you're reading about Friedman, and now you have to adjudicate that with these other things.
Yeah.
How did that can you recapture that at all?
Yeah, I could try. I knew, like I said before, I became knowledgeable of the Austrians basically through the criticism and the problems of socialism. And, also as an undergraduate, I had read Hayek's Road to Serfdom. I loved reading Mises's Socialism book.
Great book, yeah.
And so that was my understanding of the Austrians and this idea of knowledge transmission through the price system and all of that. And I wasn't exposed to, I didn't discover on my own Austrian business cycle theory. So the macro portion of it, I just wasn't all that aware of. So I'm kind of like juggling balls a little bit as an undergraduate, because I got the property rights stuff, the public choice, the Austrian notion of knowledge in the market pricing system, the problems of socialist planning, and then I got this Friedman type monetarism.
Yeah.
And so all these things are going on at once.
Right.
I wanted to mention Rothbard. I don't know how I discovered Rothbard, but I remember looking in the card catalog, the old card catalog days in the library, and looking up to see if there's anything by Rothbard in there. And I had heard, he's got this vision of, anarcho-capitalism and all that. And here in the shelves was Power and Market. And I remember pulling the book off the shelf, sitting cross-legged on the floor, and reading the first chapter and being disappointed.
Yeah.
I had a level of excitement and a quick disappointment early on with Rothbard's, case for pure market.
I have a slightly different one, because I read Man, Economy, and State, and then I read For a New Liberty. And For a New Liberty, I was completely, at that time, I was struggling on how you take notations in your books. So someone told me about highlighters. Mm-hmm. So I didn't understand that you had to be adjudicating on the highlighter. So I'd end up by highlighting a whole page. It was like, right? So then I would go back and reread, and I'd underline in red, And then I decided, okay, well, this is stupid, because I'm ruining these books and I don't even know what they're telling me, by doing this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to now read books, and wherever there's something I disagree with, I'm going to put underneath it like a wavy line. And that way I know when I come to it, you might know some of this because you've seen some of my books back in graduate school. I mean, I at one time I used to put like giant bubble, like emphasis points and stuff. And so anyway, so I read For a New Liberty.
Wait a minute. I remember when you announced and showed us that you're doing big, fat exclamation points. You announced your new method.
I didn't know what the hell I was doing, still don't. But I read For a New Liberty, and I read all the way through the book. Think about how absurd this is. And there's not a single line. There's nothing. Every word I agreed with. Every word I agreed with. So I was like, oh my God, Rothbard is my guru, right? Rothbard's Mises is convoluted. Rothbard is this he tells stories about Joe Dokes and, the Brooklyn Dodgers. And so he's like a normal guy telling us about all this stuff like that. And so then I pick up Power and Market, and I'll never forget it. I think it's on page 9 when he dismisses national defense, like just out of hand like this.
Right.
And I remember thinking, it can't be that easy. Right? And so that's what devastated me, because I went from, reading For a New Liberty, which I thought was the best polemic. It's so much better in my mind at that time than Free to Choose or The Road to Serfdom, The Leaker. Hayek is leaks all over the place. Hayek, Rothbard has this wonderful piece. And Man, Economy, and State taught me so much about economics. What I didn't understand in Mises, Man, Economy, and State made clear for me. And I still think that's the case. I think it's a really, anyway, sorry, but go ahead.
No. It's interesting that you say page 9 of Power and Market, because I should say one thing first. I have not read For a New Liberty cover to cover. Yeah. I've only poked my head into it a couple times. So that's not what inspired me with Rothbard. I was more interested, not so much in a even back then, not so much in an ideological program, but theoretical, and what economics could be. And you said page 9 or whatever it is from Power and Market. See, that was the chapter I had read. There's this whole case against national defense. It could all be provided private. And that was, just like you said, you were disappointed when you read. Well, that's the first thing of Rothbard that I read.
Yeah, and I can remember, Ethics of Liberty came out right around like when I was starting to be ready to go to graduate school or whatever. And I can remember thinking being so excited that finally Rothbard was going to have another book
Sure.
And then I came up with this phrase, which is a terrible, because I benefited tremendously from them, but I'm sure you've heard me say this, which is Freeman articles with footnotes.
Yeah, right.
And I was like, this is what we got, like that. And then I read the Jerome Chichili book, and I was like, busting up about all of it, because I was like, so that again is why Lavoie all of a sudden becomes someone different, because he was taking these ideas seriously, but he was treating them seriously enough as a theoretical system and as something in the grand debate over tradition, market, and plan, and what the alternative is and everything. And so, I have a question for you, though, about your monetarism. So again, this is a little bit of a time blur, but I can remember you and I, this actually might come from Alchin, okay? But via Hayek as well, which is, I can remember you and I in a market process seminar in which Don Boudreau, as a visiting student from Auburn, is presenting a paper that he did with Randy Holcomb, in which they are looking at price level adjustments. And I can remember you and I saying, what is a price level? Mm-hmm. Talk to me about relative prices. It's relative prices that impinge upon economic decision making. Right. No one makes a decision on the price level. Talk about that. Now, that's an extremely Austrian, but also Alchin point, I think. And I'm trying to remember what year that must have been, because I keep on thinking, it's early, but maybe it's much later.
No, Pete. I forgot all about that, but you've stirred my memory here, and it was early on because Don Boudreau wasn't there as a professor.
That's right.
Which he would later be. He was there as a grad student,
and it wasn't his job talk. It was just a regular seminar.
Yeah, and you know what? That also that also reminds me, Ed Dolan's book.
Yeah.
Remember that one? Well, I can't remember the title now.
Foundations of Modern Austrian
Economics.
Yeah.
I somehow got my hands on that as an undergraduate. So I was exposed to a little bit the beginnings of some Austrian macro theory. Lockman had an article in there.
Yeah, but that also would have introduced you to Rothbard, because Rothbard stands out in those volumes in a way that he doesn't later on in literature.
And how that book really resonated with me.
Yeah, that was a very important.
Yeah, Dolan talks about Kuhn and paradigms in that book.
Yeah, so it fits right in.
And it fit right in, and that was the point where I understood that Austrian economics is not just some verbal variant of free market economics and all of that. That Austrian economics is, or certainly at least appears to be, some type of different and emerging paradigm. And that really excited me. And you know what? That reminds me, when I finally got to campus at George Mason, the first person I met was not Don. And I became Don's research assistant for his two books in 84 and 85. The first person I meet is Rich Fink. And I remember I sat down in his office, I was nervous, and we're talking, and I think he was simply trying to get an intellectual feel for me. Where is this kid coming from?
Right.
What's, Northern Michigan University, what's that, right? And I remember saying, and it's kind of sounded stupid, and in a way I wanted it to sound a little silly. I said, he said, what's Austrian economics? He asked me a question like that. And I said, the way I look at it is like standard economics sees, and this is the paradigm thing, sees the Earth as the center of the solar system, if not the universe. And the Austrians are acting under a different it's a paradigm shift, and they say the sun as the center of the solar system and the universe. And Richie said immediately, he said, as far as he's concerned, Austrians don't know where the center of the universe is. And bang! I remember being floored by that and thinking on the spot, I'm at the right place.
Yeah.
I made the right decision. Because there's
do you remember this? We're out for after a Lockman visit, and we go to a Austrian restaurant that is in Northern Virginia, or a German restaurant, maybe it's in Northern Virginia, and you ask Lockman, right? If the world is kaleidoscopic, who's turning the kaleidoscope?
Yeah.
And Lockman just turns to you and says, "Ah, that is the question." I remember that.
I remember that.
But
I think he said it with a cigar in his mouth, too.
Yeah, the other funny line that night was Lavoie, thinking that now this was an entree into more and more philosophical conversations. Right. Lockman says to him, "Mr. Chairman, now is the time to drink beer, not discuss philosophy."
Yes.
And I remember falling in love with Lockman at that point.
Oh, yeah.
So I wanted to ask you about the center. I'm getting lost a little bit in details because there's so much of I feel like talking to you or Emily or Steve in some sense is that we're like siblings that were raised in the same household, but have all different relationships with our parents.
Yes.
So it's kind of a weird kind of thing because we're all students of Don and we all work with Don in our own way. And we had, our ups and downs, mostly ups, but some downs with interacting with him and all of that. But the Center for Study of Market Processes, to me, still represents this kind of ideal environment of learning in which there was a tremendous egalitarian approach to the way teachers interacted with us. In fact, I can remember Rich Fink sitting down with me. I shared an office with him. And so, because he was in one side of the office, I was in the other side of this broom closet office. And I remember him asking me, so how are we doing? And I'm like, what do you mean? And he's like, well, are we meeting your expectations as a student, or are we exceeding them, falling? You came here, you went out of your way to do this. What are we doing? And no one at NYU ever asked that to the students, And those guys all thought about that. Now, again, they were all assistant professors, but think about it. You have Don, Jack, Richie, Victor Vanberg, DiLorenzo even. Yeah. They're all there, and they're in this soup. And then you add Boudreau and Selgin into the mix later on. And then, of course, you and I were very lucky. We had Mike Alexiev, who was not, but he was very important to our education. We had, I would actually add Kevin Greer into that mix in a weird way because he was an econometrician and he put up with our stuff.
Let me jump in for a second and say that Mike Alexiev and Kevin Greer were really important for our development.
Yeah.
Because they kept us honest.
Yeah, that's right.
And especially with Mike, because remember, we're running around criticizing equilibrium and all of that, and we knew half of what we were saying, but Mike Alexiev taught us general equilibrium theory, and he said, no, we'd have some criticism, and he'd say, no, we handle this with convergence or stability, and we needed to understand what we were talking about before we could even start criticizing it. And I think Mike was terribly important in our development as Austrians for that reason. And his Soviet economics course was really good.
We had him for multiple classes and multiple bites of the apple on that, and also directed readings on this. But I'm thinking Micro 2. He's having us not only, work through Varian, which is a workman-like book of standard microeconomics, but we're reading Silverberg on the structure of economic arguments. We had supposedly already in the earlier class mastered Henderson and Quant and that kind of stuff. Gould and Ferguson, Henderson and Quant. So our textbooks and everything were pretty standard neoclassical economics given at the time. I mean, within a few short periods of time after we were there, Krebs and the whole game theory revolution takes off. And at that time, we were learning game theory. It would have been through Victor Vanberg and more like the Andy Schotter evolution of institutions kind of stuff. But I keep on always thinking back to Mike. Mike actually assigned us De Bruce book. That little
that.
pain in the ass book that's like this big and as dense as you possibly can do. And it's not like he gave us a pass and said like, oh yeah, you don't have to read it or whatever, right? So yeah.
Yeah, with that book, I we had to learn topology on the fly, Pete. We knew calculus. We had to learn topology, which I never took as an undergraduate. And DeBrew's book is loaded with it. And I struggled through it. I pull it off the shelves. And I'll tell you when I pull it off my shelf. When I have a student saying they want to go to grad school in economics, I pull 2 books off the shelf. I said, this is what I had, Varian, which no one uses now,
right.
But Varian. And I said, look at the math in this. And I said, this is what I had. I pull out DeBrew and hand it to the student and say, this is what I had to go through in my Micro 2 course. And it kind of floors the students. And some will rise to the occasion and say, okay, I have to take more math.
Yeah.
Some will be turned off. But we got to be honest with our undergraduates who want to go to grad school. But yeah, it was really high-powered stuff in Mike Alexiev's course.
He was a great teacher. And, and we were very fortunate because he didn't allow us to slide at all. He held us to a higher standard, I think, actually, because we were critics. But he also gave us space. Like, you'll probably remember this, but he let me give a lecture in the class about Abraham Bald and the evolution of general equilibrium theory. And I had to, do a history of thought of Abraham.
Right.
And Brouwer's fixed point theorem and like what Bald did to prove existence and all that stuff. And I mean, I love that. And if you remember, you and I also tried to tell Greer that we found a fundamental error in econometric theory.
I still try to remember what that was. I was certain that there was an error. But let's forget that. I remember Kevin just laughing at us.
Yes, but at the same time, he also didn't just say, you guys are idiots or whatever, right? He'd say, okay.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.